Have you ever paused and thought about trust in a really specific way? Not just, do I trust them, but a much more personal question, maybe even a bit vulnerable. Can they trust me?
Mm.
It's a subtle shift, isn't it?
Yeah.
But pretty profound when you think about it. Today, we're doing a deep dive into a concept that really tackles this head on. We're exploring how we might actually move trust from this, elusive feeling to something genuinely quantifiable.
Such a crucial distinction.
Yeah.
Because trust, well, it's undeniably foundational to everything we do, right?
Hmm.
Our personal relationships, how we work together professionally, the very fabric of society. Yet, it feels so inherently subjective, almost impossible to really nail down. How do you prove your trustworthiness? I mean, in a measurable way.
Exactly. And that specific thought, that kind of personal observation, is actually what sparked the entire research we're going to unpack today. We're talking about Dr. Lev Moten and his, pretty groundbreaking paper on measuring innate and behavioral trust. He talks about this pivotal moment in a high-stakes business discussion. Someone genuinely asked him point blank, "Can I trust you?" Wow.
Yeah. And he said he was just instantly caught off guard because, we're so used to being the evaluators, right? Assessing other people. But when the focus flips, when it's about proving our own trustworthiness, it's a whole different ballgame.
That's fascinating. And what Dr. Moten realized, as he describes it, was that his first instinct would have been to have a ready answer if someone asked, "Do you trust me?" But that mirror image question, "Can I trust you?" Well, that exposed the real challenge. He realized, while we have tools like lie detectors for very specific truths, maybe there's just no reliable, quantifiable way to measure someone's general trustworthiness across all the complex situations life throws at us.
So the core challenge he set out to tackle was this. Could we actually develop a method, maybe even a system, something that quantifies a person's overall trustworthiness, maybe on a scale, say, 1 to 100, beyond just a specific lie or a single context? And that's really our mission for this deep dive. We're going to unpack Dr. Moten's proposed solution. It's called the Individual Trustfulness Index, or ITI. And he outlines 4 distinct trustfulness gauge systems, ITGs, designed to calculate it. It's really about trying to transform trustworthiness from this subjective feeling into a measurable data point.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit more. Trust, like we said, it's incredibly fundamental. I mean, think about it. Every human interaction, really, from a simple handshake to, a complex international treaty, it all relies on some level of trust.
Absolutely. And you see huge differences culturally, right? In some cultures, interpersonal trust is so strong that contracts are almost symbolic, just a formality. But in others where that cultural trust maybe isn't as strong, even the most detailed contracts can barely hold weight without that underlying trust. It's elusive, but completely essential.
Right. And what's really bold, I think, and maybe even a bit controversial in this paper, is the proposal that trustworthiness, much like cognitive capacity or maybe temperament, might actually have an innate component.
Exactly. The ITI is envisioned as this standardized metric, a score, like you said, 1 to 100, designed to quantify a person's general trustworthiness across different contexts, social, professional, ethical situations. The goal is to make it reliably measurable, not just a gut feeling.
And to get to that ITI score, Dr. Moten proposes these 4 distinct ITG systems, and they kind of progress, right? They move from just observable behavior, what we can see, all the way to incredibly advanced biological analysis.
That's right. You've got ITG1, which is purely behavioral, then ITG2, which leverages high-tech sensors and AI. ITG3 is a kind of smart hybrid, blending the two. And finally, ITG4, which is really pushing the boundaries. It's a biologically based approach.
So to really measure the slippery quality, Dr. Moten suggests we start with what we can actually see and hear. That's ITG1, right?
Exactly. First up is ITG1, the non-technical trustfulness gauge. This is purely human-centered, no tech involved, at least not directly. Think of it like a highly sophisticated, very structured interview and observation process. Its core components include things like a trust scenario bank. These are like real-life ethical dilemmas designed to reveal character. There's also a historical consistency log, which is basically a record of verifiable past behaviors, and crucially, something called observer triangulation. This means you have 3 independent raters providing structured evaluations. It adds objectivity.
3 raters, okay.
Yeah, and they also align what someone says about themselves, their self-reports from interviews, with their observed actions, checking for consistency.
So it's kind of like a super interview process then. You'd go through structured questionnaires, maybe role play some scenarios, and then they'd check what you said against your actual track record, like your job history or reputation. It's all about looking for those subtle cues.
Precisely. It's about digging deeper than surface answers.
Can you maybe walk us through some practical examples from ITG1? Like, what kind of questions or scenarios are we talking about, and what kind of answers would really stand out?
Absolutely. For instance, a question might be something like, describe a time when someone trusted you and you actually felt uncomfortable about it. What did you do?
Uncomfortable.
That's interesting.
Right. Because for someone scoring high on this ITI, their answer would likely reflect on the burden of that trust, how they honored it, maybe complex emotions involved, a real awareness of the responsibility. But someone with a potentially low ITI, they might struggle to invent that kind of nuance. Or maybe they'd give a really generic, overly positive story that just lacks emotional depth.
Okay, so it reveals how much someone grapples with the weight of trust.
Exactly. It shows that the capacity for self-reflection, for acknowledging ethical complexity, that's a far greater indicator of trustworthiness than a simple yes or no answer.
Okay, that's really insightful. You mentioned scenarios, too. Give me another one, maybe one that feels a bit like a test.
Okay, here's one that's described as almost a track. You are accidentally copied on a confidential email. It reveals that a coworker, who is also your friend, is about to be terminated. What do you do? Oh, wow. Yeah, that definitely pits empathy against ethics, doesn't it? Loyalty versus confidentiality.
It absolutely does, and that's the point. This scenario is explicitly designed to reveal where an individual's true loyalties lie when faced with those conflicting values.
Well,
Someone with a high ITI. They'd likely carefully weigh the consequences, show some emotional discipline,
yeah.
maybe even seek ethical advice before acting. They wouldn't just react.
Right.
Whereas someone with a lower ITI might, well, maybe reveal the information directly to their friend, or perhaps try to dodge responsibility, maybe hiding behind the idea of friendship or loyalty.
So it shows how much value they place on ethical discipline, on upholding broader principles, even when it's personally difficult.
Precisely. It tests that willingness.
That's a powerful way to assess priorities. And then there's another example mentioned, something about analyzing a story.
Ah, yes, the story analysis. So you're given a short story. Let's say a character finds an expensive item that someone lost, returns it, and then gets mocked by their peers for not just keeping it. The question then is, do you admire this person, or do you think they were naive?
Okay.
Here, a high ITI person would likely identify with the character's moral strength. Even though they face ridicule, they did the right thing. They see the integrity, the resolve. But a low ITI individual, they might actually justify the peer mocking or express skepticism about the act itself, maybe questioning why the character didn't just keep the item.
I see. So ITG1 demonstrates that even without fancy tech, our internal landscape, our emotions, how we grapple with ethical burdens, these are pretty clear signals of trustworthiness.
Exactly. It sets a baseline based on observable, nuanced human behavior and reflection.
Okay, so if ITG1 gives us these deep insights through careful human observation, what happens when we start layering in, the power of cutting-edge technology? That's where ITG2 comes in, right? The technical trustfulness gauge. This sounds much more high-tech.
It definitely is. This is a non-invasive, sensor-based approach. The idea is that AI analyzes your physiological and behavioral responses to moral challenges. Imagine being, well, not exactly hooked up, but monitored by a whole suite of sensors.
What kind of sensors are we talking about?
It's quite an impressive array, actually. The core components include an extensive sensor suite. Think eye tracking, which reveals where your focus really lies, what catches your attention. Facial EMG electromyography, which measures tiny muscle movements in your face, often reveals micro-expressions you're not even aware you're making.
Wow.
Then there's heart rate variability, or HRV, which can expose very subtle emotional shifts. Galvanic skin response, GSR that measures changes in sweat gland activity linked to emotional arousal, thermal imaging detecting tiny changes in facial temperature patterns, voice stress analysis picking up on vocal tremors or strain, and even, optionally, EEG electroencephalography measuring brainwave activity.
It's a lot of data points.
It is. And you're also subjected to what's called a trust question protocol, maybe 20 calibrated questions specifically designed to trigger trust-related cognitive and emotional responses. All of this data then feeds into an AI analysis engine. And this AI has been trained on huge data sets of known, trustworthy, and untrustworthy profiles.
Okay, so the protocol involves setting up the sensors, getting a baseline reading with maybe neutral questions first.
Exactly. Establish a baseline.
And then they apply the ethical questions, the dilemmas, and the sensors capture. What did the paper say? Over 1,000 variables per minute.
Something like that, yeah. A massive amount of data.
And then a neural network crunches it all and computes your trust index based on your response patterns. So what do these sensors actually reveal about trustworthiness that maybe ITG1 misses?
Well, consider an example like the audio-visual story playback. Let's say you watch a short video. Someone finds a wallet, hesitates a few times, looks around, maybe clearly wrestling with the decision before finally returning it anonymously. The sensors would measure your micro-expressions, your pupil dilation, maybe changes in facial temperature as you watch.
Okay, and what's the difference?
A high ITI individual would likely show measured engagement. You might see signs of warmth, perhaps, during the character's hesitation, and then maybe relief or satisfaction when the wallet is returned, a sort of empathetic mirroring. But someone with a low ITI, they might exhibit emotional flatness throughout, or maybe their response peaks only at the moment of discovery finding the wallet, but not during the ethical resolution part.
Ah, I see. So it tells us that true trustworthiness involves a more complete, empathetic engagement with the whole process of ethical decision-making, not just the outcome or the initial event.
Exactly. It's not just what you react to, but how and when your physiology responds. It suggests a deeper resonance.
That's fascinating. What about voice stress? Can that really tell us something reliable about trustworthiness?
It's one piece of the puzzle. In a voice stress story retelling, you might be asked to recount, say, an embarrassing or maybe ethically questionable event from your youth, something personal. The sensors analyze your voice for microtremors, irregular breath patterns, things like that. A high ITI person would likely show emotional congruence with the story's moral complexity,
Meaning?
meaning they wouldn't just gloss over the discomfort or the ethical ambiguity. Their voice would genuinely reflect it. You'd hear the complexity. A low ITI person, on the other hand, might show a real lack of emotional reaction, or maybe excessive vocal control, almost like they're trying too hard to mask something to keep it flat.
Right. So it highlights how an authentic connection between your story, your memory, and your body's reaction, your physiology, is a key indicator of internal consistency.
It's harder to fake that.
Much harder. That makes a lot of sense. And I'm curious about consistency again. How does the AI test that when it's mainly dealing with these, involuntary physiological responses?
Good question. They use something called mismatch detection. The AI is programmed to subtly vary questions over time, specifically to test narrative consistency alongside the physiological data. For example, you might be asked early on, what does integrity mean to you? Pretty standard. But then later, maybe phrased differently, was there ever a time when you felt you acted with the opposite of integrity?
Oh.
The AI then looks for incongruent physiological signals. For instance, are you showing signs of stress when recalling a supposedly truthful event? Or are you unnaturally calm when recounting something that should evoke an emotional response, like a past transgression? This gauge, ITG2, it really heavily weights that non-conscious physiological congruence. The symmetry between what's being said and how the body's reacting. It often reveals deeper truths than just our conscious spoken responses alone.
Yeah, it's hard to consciously control your heart rate or micro-expressions consistently, I imagine.
Exactly. It's trying to get beneath the performance.
Okay, that's a deep dive into the tech side, revealing things we might not even be aware of ourselves. Now, ITG3, the hybrid trustfulness gauge. This one sounds like it tries to get the best of both worlds.
That's the idea, yes. It combines the human observation, the nuanced insights from ITG1, with some of the lighter technical inputs from ITG2 for, hopefully, enhanced accuracy.
So it's about synthesizing multiple layers of data.
Precisely. The core components are still observer-based evaluation, like in ITG1, but you also have a wearable sensor kit, maybe think a thermal camera, a heart rate monitor, a voice analyzer, things that are less intrusive than the full ITG2 suite, and of course an AI scoring engine to help process it all.
And the protocol, how does that work?
Well, it involves conducting behavioral sessions, like the interviews and scenarios from ITG1, alongside sensor sessions where the wearables are active. Then, the key is aligning the behavioral insights, what the observers noted, with the sensor data. The final score is a computation based on observer judgment, the sensor analysis, and that behavioral alignment. It gives a more robust, multifaceted picture.
So it's not just a human deciding or a machine deciding, but a really nuanced combination. Give us an example of how this might play out in a test scenario. What does this hybrid approach catch?
Okay, one compelling example they describe is the ethical chain reaction. Imagine you're presented with a 5-step story or scenario. Each step involves an increasing level of ethical compromise, maybe for personal gain or for group benefit. At each stage, you're asked, would you proceed? Now, the observers are watching your behavioral cues, hesitation, maybe forced smiles, tone shifts, while the wearable sensors are tracking things like heart rate and subtle voice changes.
Okay, so it's tracking your response as the ethical stakes get higher.
Exactly. A high ITI individual would likely withdraw early in the chain, or at least express significant discomfort throughout the process, which would be picked up by both observers and sensors. But a low ITI person, they might adapt more easily, maybe even smile or rationalize the later, more compromised steps. The sensors might pick up less congruent stress signals.
That reveals something about what the paper called ethical fatigue resistance, how long someone can maintain their moral compass under pressure.
Precisely. It tests that resolve over time, not just in a single snapshot.
Oh, that's a clever setup. It almost makes you think twice about how you'd answer under that kind of escalating pressure, doesn't it? What about consistency again? How does the hybrid approach tackle that?
They use a surprise consistency test here too, but with that extra layer. You might be asked to recall an earlier answer, or maybe restate a moral view you expressed after a delay, say, 30 minutes later. Now, if your narrative remains consistent and your physiology picked up by the wearables matches that consistency, e.g., calm recall of a previously stated calm belief, that indicates trustworthiness. But if your narrative shifts, or even if it stays the same, but your physiological markers are suddenly different, maybe showing stress where there was none before or vice versa, without a corresponding emotional reason noted by observers,
Yeah.
well, that suggests performance control, a deliberate attempt to manage perception rather than authentic recall.
That makes so much sense. The combination really strengthens the check. You can't easily fake both the story and the physiological response consistently over time, especially under surprise conditions.
It becomes much harder, yes.
How about a vocal challenge? Does ITG3 use voice analysis too?
Yes, in something called the vocal contrast challenge. Here, you might be asked to read aloud two similar moral stories, but one involves clear self-sacrifice for an ethical principle, while the other involves personal gain that's kind of masked as virtue. The sensors analyze vocal tone, pitch variation, emotional energy. A high ITI person would likely show more effective investment, more genuine emotional engagement reflected in their voice when reading the self-sacrifice story.
And the low ITI person?
They might show equal engagement in both. Or, perhaps, even more vocal energy or engagement when reading the story about personal gain disguised as virtue. So this gauge, ITG3, really focuses on how well our behavior and the tech readings correlate. It looks for that congruence, that narrative stability, and that resistance to ethical fatigue.
Okay, so that covers the behavioral, the technical, and the hybrid. Now we get to the real frontier, right? ITG4, the genomic neurobiological trustfulness gauge. This sounds, well, almost science fiction.
It is definitely the most speculative and cutting-edge model proposed. It's built on a really profound premise. The trustworthiness might be, at least in part, fundamentally genetically and neurologically encoded, much like perhaps IQ or certain aspects of temperament.
The idea that our very biology could predispose us towards or away from trustworthiness, that's a revolutionary concept. It really challenges the purely social or learned understandings of how trust works.
It absolutely does. It delves right into our biology. The core components here include analyzing specific genetic markers, certain genes like OXTR related to oxytocin, AVPR1A, DRD4, COMT, MAOA, 5-HTTLPR, which have been linked in various complex ways to traits like empathy, impulsivity, or social bonding.
Okay, so genetics is one part.
Then there's neuroimaging, using fMRI or EEG to actually observe brain activity patterns while someone is making ethical decisions or responding to trust-related stimuli. They also measure neurochemical baselines, maybe sampling for levels of hormones and neurotransmitters like oxytocin, cortisol, and serotonin, which are known to influence social behavior and stress response.
Wow.
And then, importantly, they calibrate all this biological data with traditional behavioral calibration, using things like trust games, standard empathy scales, and moral dilemma testing, similar perhaps to ITG1, but used here to ground the biological findings. All of this massively complex data is then fed into an AI composite score, using machine learning to find patterns and predict the ITI.
So it's collecting your DNA, scanning your brain activity, taking chemical samples, and observing your behavior all at once and feeding it to an AI. That's intense. What kind of truly fascinating insights can this level of analysis reveal? Where might trust be literally hardwired?
Well, consider an example they call the oxytocin-cortisol crossload. Let's say you read a story about a significant betrayal or injustice involving strangers, something designed to provoke empathy or outrage. Samples for oxytocin, the bonding hormone, and cortisol, the stress hormone, are taken before and after reading.
And the difference would be?
For a potentially high ITI individual, you might see a rise in oxytocin levels, indicating an empathetic response, but with relatively stable cortisol levels. They connect emotionally without becoming overwhelmed by personal stress. But for a potentially low ITI person, You might see a cortisol spike, a stress response, but with little or no corresponding oxytocin shift. This could suggest a self-focused stress reaction without that empathetic connection to the others involved.
That's a remarkably clear potential biological differentiator. What about actually seeing the brain process right from wrong?
That's the idea behind the moral ambiguity MRI game. While someone is in an fMRI scanner, which tracks blood flow and thus brain activity, they're presented with really difficult moral paradoxes. The classic example is something like, is it okay to steal from a very rich person to pay for your desperately ill mother's life-saving surgery?
The tough ones.
Exactly. The system measures which parts of the brain become most active. For a high ITI profile, the prediction is that areas associated with ethical reasoning and cognitive control, particularly the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, would dominate the activity. Even amidst the obvious emotional conflict, rational thought prevails. For a low ITI profile, perhaps the emotional centers like the amygdala might dominate activity. Or in some cases, there might even be a shutdown or unusual pattern, indicating a different way of processing such conflicts, perhaps bypassing deep ethical reasoning.
So you could literally see how someone's brain weighs right and wrong under pressure.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
And on the genetic side, how does that factor into a final ITI score? It's not just you have the bad gene, right?
Oh, absolutely not. It's much more complex. The genomic vulnerability composite identifies the presence of certain gene variants or alleles that have been statistically linked with traits like impulsivity, lower empathy, or aggression. Things like MAOAL or DRD47R are mentioned as examples. But, and this is crucial, trustworthiness isn't seen as solely determined by these genes. It's factored alongside regulatory functions and other indicators. So someone might have a risk allele, but if their neuroimaging shows strong empathetic responses and their behavioral tests are solid, their ITI might still be moderate or even high. It's about the interplay.
Right.
So this ITG, ITG4, it heavily weights that genetic predisposition, but also neurochemical stability, neural integrity under conflict, and the capacity for empathetic generalization. It suggests a deeper biological underpinning to trustworthiness, interacting with environment and experience. Okay, wow. So we've journeyed through these 4 really fascinating and progressively complex systems. Let's try and bring it all together now with a quick comparative summary. Where does each one fit best? ITG1, the purely behavioral one, seems like it's low cost, pretty accessible, and maybe best for informal vetting. Small businesses, perhaps, where that deep personal insight is really valued.
That sounds right. Good for situations where you can invest the time in observation and interviews. Then ITG2, the high-tech sensor and AI model. That's high cost, potentially high accuracy, but accessibility is low. You need the lab, the tech. So ideal for really high-stakes situations, maybe national security screening, serious fraud prevention where objective, hard-to-fake data is absolutely paramount.
Right. Then ITG3, the hybrid system, kind of middle ground. Medium cost, still high accuracy, medium accessibility because it uses wearables, not a full lab. The paper suggests this could be good for things like selecting leaders, high-level hiring, maybe evaluating investment teams, where you want both that human intuition and the objective data check.
Exactly. A balanced approach for critical roles. And finally, ITG4, the genomic and neurobiological frontier. Very high cost, currently very low accessibility. It's still largely conceptual or research-based, but it promises potentially very high accuracy in the long run, maybe applicable someday for elite selection processes or very long-term performance prediction. It's really pushing the boundaries of understanding trust.
And looking across all 4, here's where I think it gets really interesting. Dr. Nemoten's overarching strategy seems clear. To try and counter manipulation and bias, this whole ITI framework stresses consistency, how people handle internal conflict, and that emotional authenticity we talked about.
Yes, it's not just about asking if someone is honest in a vacuum. It's about seeing how their inner systems, behavioral, physiological, maybe even neurological, respond when honesty actually comes at a cost, or when temptation arises.
It's about leveraging all these subtleties, from a hesitant answer in an interview to a flicker in brain activity, to try and expose that authentic core, to reveal how people might behave when they think no one is watching, or when their true nature is really challenged by a situation.
And the argument is that this multi-layered approach significantly raises the potential reliability of trustworthiness measurement. It opens up possible applications across clinical settings, corporate hiring, security clearances, maybe even improving interpersonal trust decisions, though that gets complicated fast. It truly challenges our standard perception of trust.
So what really stands out to you, the listener, after hearing all this, is this core conclusion from the paper. Trust might not just be something we learn or decide. It might actually be, in part, hardwired. The individual trustfulness index and these four different gauge systems offer this whole spectrum of methods, from simple observation to complex biology, for trying to quantify this elusive yet absolutely vital human trait. We now have these conceptual tools, at least, to begin treating trust not merely as a feeling or a judgment, but potentially as quantifiable data.
Which inevitably leads to a pretty profound question, doesn't it? If trustworthiness can indeed be quantified, measured with increasing accuracy, how might that fundamentally change our interactions,
Mm-hmm.
our societal structures, even our basic understanding of ourselves and each other?
Yeah. What does it truly mean for knowing yourself and knowing others in a world where trust might become just another data point on a profile? And how could that shape the very nature of human connection, for better or for worse?
It's a huge shift to consider.
Definitely. Something truly worth pondering long after this deep dive ends.